I want to introduce Zach. Zach is a software engineer and a consultant who comes from a non-traditional background into the tech world. And with him today, we're going to talk about his unique learning journey, his experience getting into tech, and his ideas and his thoughts on the future of careers in software engineering, web development, and tech in general. Zach, if you could please share a few words about yourself to make sure that everybody knows who you are.
Thanks so much for having me. It's wonderful to be here with you all. Yeah, I don't come from a traditional technology background, which we can get into, but sort of nothing in my past life should have predicted that, I would work as a software engineer now and, I enjoy the career that I enjoy in software. And the road to getting to that place in my career, at least in my case, was a bit of a strange one. I guess in part because, programs like Practicum weren't as available when, I was trying to navigate that journey. So I'm really happy to be here with you all and to share what it is that I've learned along the road, and hopefully you can avoid some of the mistakes that I made along the way.
Thank you very much, Zach. So I think let's start with your learning journey. You probably don't know, but I think most of the students here do know that here at Practicum, we're big fans of Barbara Oakley. And actually one of the first projects that our web development students do is called Learning How to Learn. So it would be great if we start with this. I want to ask you, and again, maybe for some who doesn't know that, Zach actually been featured in one of Barbara Oakley's books, Mindshift. So if you could share a little bit of your educational story and tell us how did you get to know Barbara, and how did you, and whether you used any of the principles that she's promoting in the way you were studying and the way you were learning how to code.
I'm very fortunate to count Barb as one of my friends, and we got connected. We first met at a conference that was focused on alternative education. At the time, I was running a small college that was focused on basically an experimental approach to education. We were borrowing a lot of ideas from an educational approach called Montessori, and we were trying to apply it to the college level, the university level. And so Barb and I met at this conference, and we just hit it off because I truly believe is like one of the leading lights of intellectually honest and like scientific analysis and understanding in modern education. As some of you probably no doubt know, the world of education and as a discipline, as an academic discipline, as an industry, there's all kinds of like varying degrees of quality of thinking in that world. There are some really good ideas, some really bad ideas, some like really ideological ideas, all of this. And Barb, to me, she just like really cuts through that and gets at the substance of like what actually works to get stuff in your brain, because it's like what we're all trying to do and struggling to do every day, right? Barb and I hit it off in part because for a chunk of my early education, from the time I was about 13 or so, I was unschooled. Unschooled is essentially an educational philosophy where you just don't go to school. People try to make it more complicated than that, but honestly, like that's basically what it boils down to. It's an approach where you don't go to school, but the idea is that you're engaging in activities as part of your day-to-day life that are educational. So it's not the rejection of learning as something important or valuable in your life. It's just simply the embrace of learning by interacting with reality and doing stuff in reality. And then the understanding that if you interact with reality, you do learn, because things work, they don't work, you get rejected, you get accepted, whatever it is that you're trying to do. And each one of those things provides a learning opportunity for the unschooler. So that was a sort of strange part of my education that I do think informed some of my ideas and some of the techniques that I undertook later on while learning to code. So on the sort of second part of this question about, like, let's say, learning to code and treating it like an unschooler, and then also Barb Oakley's work in coding, I would say that there's really like a lot there to be applied to the education of a software engineer. So let's start with Barbara Oakley's work. For example, I think a lot of early career developers underestimate the amount of memorization that is involved in software engineering. Memorization gets a bad rap in education because there's even this this slang term called drill and kill in English. The idea that, like, hey, if you keep drilling someone on this concept, you're just like killing their motivation to learn, and you're just crushing them beneath this repetitive kind of drill behavior, right? Of like doing flashcards or something. But in fact, as you all have learned studying Barbara Oakley's work, drilling things and memorizing things is a cornerstone of expertise. And for something like software, it's incredibly important simply because having the fluency with the verbs and nouns of the languages that you're using is, I mean, it is unavoidable. It is an unavoidable total cornerstone of the expertise necessary to be a professional software engineer and to ship code that people want to read in that works. The way that Barb puts it that I really like is, if you have to, for instance, look up every verb and noun in French, do you really speak French? Like, can you really say I speak French when I have to consult the dictionary for every single word? Like, not really. You don't really speak French because, it's not, the patterns, the fundamental patterns are not held in your long-term memory. So what does this mean concretely for the process of engineering? Tons of flashcards. Like, I obsessively use flashcards while learning. Many of the people that I was learning with, I think, saw it as like a nerdy over-engineering of the process that you were doing. But the reality is that it pays off. And it pays off because it frees up your working memory to focus on the things that actually add value. Things like, how do I solve this problem? What's the architecture of this? What's the right algorithm? All this kind of stuff. You have to have your mind free to focus on solving the problems. And if you're bogged down in syntax, your mind isn't free to focus on those things. So that's an example of Barb Oakley's work applied directly to software engineering, which is getting procedural fluency in your tools is the foundation upon which you're able to achieve more advanced things. And the more advanced things are the things that like help you become a senior software engineer or an architect, or the kinds of things that people are often striving to do in the long run in their career. From the standpoint of, let's say, applying these like unschooling kinds of ideas. So I'm a big believer personally that one of the best things you can do when you get out of a program like practicum is to build a lot of crappy little things. And it's hard to do this because people who, you want something to be perfect and you want it to be amazing, right? And I get that, I felt the same way. But the reality is that it's more about closing the learning loop as many times as you can in that early phase. And I've met developers, like early career developers, who, they're working on some open source project, and maybe it's a cool idea, but they'll spend 6 months trying to make this thing like the most amazing open source project ever, and maybe their skills just aren't there yet to encounter all the problems that are involved in that project, and they frustrate themselves and they become demoralized and sort of sad about it because they can't ship this sort of masterpiece when they've been programming for 9 months or something. And to me, it's just like kind of, it's just not a very fair way even to treat yourself at that phase of your learning. So to put it concretely, like when I was first getting into programming, I did this thing that I jokingly called the Pythonathon, which is like a marathon for Python. And what I did was I spent 30 days just building as many like crappy little things in Python as I possibly could. And the secret here to this approach is not to pick projects at random, but to link a project, like a crappy little thing, with one of the dominant tools or libraries that you will be expected to use as a developer in that language. So for example, in the world of Python, there's a web scraping library called Beautiful Soup. And Beautiful Soup is like an industry standard for parsing HTML and for web scraping tasks, and it's common in data oriented workflows, and then also even in web development workflows. So instead of building a masterpiece, find something that forces you to use Beautiful Soup. So in my case, what I did was I made a little web app that scraped book titles from this like used bookstore that I really like online. And it was like my own personal discovery engine for finding like random used books and stuff. Is it amazing? No. Is it going to win an award? No. Like, it's not. That was not an amazing project, but who cares, right? Because I encountered Beautiful Soup, and then 2 years later in my career, when I was tasked with web scraping, when I had to go and use Beautiful Soup, it was like, oh, not only do I know this tool, but I've already encountered the fundamental problems associated with how you use that tool and what web scraping is, right? Like, what are the generalized problems of web scraping? It's like I encountered that enough in the context of that one crappy little project, but it paid dividends in the long run. So the project was really not kind of the goal, right? So that's an example of, say, a more data-oriented framework. I also, at that time, I used Pyramid, which is kind of like, it's an MVC framework, a sort of web development framework for Python. And so each of the crappy little projects, I just built a very simple front end using Pyramid. And that was, again, to expose yourself not just to the industry tools, but also to the generalized patterns that are associated with something like building a website. After you've worked for a few years in the industry, you realize that like all these web frameworks and stuff that seems so confusing when you're first getting into it, they're kind of all accomplishing the same set of tasks. And so when you start recognizing those common patterns between the frameworks, picking up a subsequent framework becomes much easier. So if you can just go and get those patterns in your brain by making 4 or 5 crappy little things that have you encounter those patterns, then when you encounter them in a new framework, it's not that big of a deal. It's much easier. So I know that was a lot there, but I guess there was a lot of that question, so I'll stop here.
Yeah, thank you very much, Zach. I am actually already myself motivated to just go and try all these tips, and I hope our students will do that too. I want to take us in a little bit different direction, but talk briefly about soft skills before we move to talking about career search. So here at Practicum, we pay a lot of attention to soft skills, and we believe that they are very crucial in finding a job and changing a job, especially when you come from a different background. And this is also something that you can take from your previous background and bring to a new field. They're transferable. So I wanted to ask you, what are the soft skills that you think you have that helped you get to where you are now?
I couldn't agree more with the premise of the question, that soft skills are transferable. And I would actually say that what I've learned, being in tech for a little while now, is that I think soft skills are really important at the very beginning of your career in tech, and then they become important again in a new way as you reach more advanced levels of being a software engineer. So it's like, there's this phase maybe where you've had your first developer job and you're just kind of getting up to speed with more technical oriented things that it may feel like soft skills have less relevance, but in fact that's the run up to when you're getting ready to, say, be considered to become a senior engineer or a staff engineer or something like that. It's like you're evaluated very much on soft skills. So anyway, the point is that it's super relevant to your career, in your job search, and then also all of a sudden later on after you've been programming for a couple of years professionally. As far as like my own journey with soft skills, like I guess I was like accidentally in sort of lucky that I had a job before going into tech where I had to do a fair amount of speaking and writing, and like I don't view myself as like someone who it came naturally to. I honestly had like horrible, debilitating stage fright for like years when I first started having to speak in front of people. And it's just over time, I just had to like eat because it was part of my job. So, you do it enough and then you kind of just like stop caring about that anxiety around it and you can just do it. So speaking and writing are both obviously like cornerstone soft skills from my perspective, but I would say a little bit deeper than that. It's particularly being able to communicate in simple and concrete ways. Someone just posted here, fake it till you make it. And yes, that's exactly right. Yeah, especially for like the speaking stuff, totally fake it till you make it. So for example, as you reach more advanced levels of engineering, often what you're doing is you're effectively arguing with other people about a solution. And you're trying to poke the solution and understand, like, is this the right direction we should go? Is this architecture right? Does this fulfill the business requirements? These kinds of things. These conversations are technical. You have to know stuff about the technology, but it really, like, effectiveness in those environments is very much predicated on you being able to say things in a way that is persuasive to others, in a way that like gets to the point and that removes noise in the communication, because everyone in technology is drowning in complexity. All the tools are complex, the tech is complex, the business requirements are complex, like the human dynamics are complex. Everything is so just like complicated all the time, that being able to go in and like pinpoint the fundamental thing and say it out loud, while that sounds simple when you sort of say it like this, it's actually very hard, and people see it as a very valuable thing. And that, of course, also is equally true of writing, right? If you are writing up something, you know, a memo about some technical solution, and you say it over 15 pages, like literally no one's going to read that. Like maybe someone who really likes you is going to read it, but like no one else on the team, they're going to say that they did, but they're not going to, because it's like too much. So being able to figure out what is actually important and condense that down into like the 1 page or the 2 page that captures the essence, which is, you know, the quintessential kind of soft skill argument, it really matters a lot. And I would say there are many developers that you'll meet along your road who may be brilliant engineers and intelligent people and nice people, but their growth is hampered by their lack of soft skills. And it's kind of sad, because especially once you spot that and you see it, you realize, like, if this person had invested more in their ability to speak and to write and to relate to other humans, like they would grow more. But you know, it's a trap that is easy to fall into. So yeah, I mean, I'd be happy. Maybe we can talk more about that in the context of job search in a minute here. But, yeah.
Definitely. I wanted to ask one more question in this section. So one of the soft skills that we also look at a lot, we call it self-driven approach. What we mean by this is being proactive and goal-oriented in what you're doing. And I think that, I assume, based on your story, that you did have to be very proactive in what you're doing and goal-oriented. And learning on your own is also not an easy task. So what kept you motivated throughout all this? And do you have any advice to our students about the way to stay motivated? Because no one is always motivated, but there are ways to keep yourself motivated longer. If you have any tips, please share.
Sure. Yeah. So, yeah, I can think of two kind of big things there. The first is that if anyone's interested in, like, say, the science around motivation and expertise, I definitely recommend Anders Ericsson, who's a famous psychologist who is kind of the scion of human expertise, like how do humans become experts. And one of the interesting findings of Anders Ericsson is that elite performers, so people who are performing in, let's say, the top 10% of their profession, really are capable of maybe 4 to 6 hours at the most of truly focused effort, where they're like full on in thing. You know, in the case of programming, it would be that feeling where you're just like deep in the problem, thinking about the problem, writing code, you know, moving things around, all that, right? And when you think about it, it's exactly deep work in the zone, where people are saying that's exactly it. So it appears that there's basically a kind of hard cap in the human brain for a given day about how many hours you can really put into something. And remember, we're talking like people that are at the top of the field. So as you're developing in the field, and as you're like building the muscle and the habit of going and doing deep work, it's not reasonable to expect that you're going to be doing 8 hours every day of like totally super deep coding. And it, well, sometimes when I say that, people think, oh, you're just like, you're going to make excuses or tell people not to work hard, or, it doesn't matter or whatever. But I just don't think that's, I don't agree with that, because the essentially motivation, the enemy of motivation is burnout. And what a lot of people will do is they'll be so inspired in the first like 2 weeks of taking on something that they will just like burn the candle at both ends, push as hard as they can, do 12 hours every day. And then after 8 days of that, they're like, this is terrible. I have zero motivation to continue because I'm miserable, because it's taken, I've burnt myself out. And this is completely counterproductive because of what Barbara Oakley talks about how it is that actually learning occurs. Learning requires spaced repetition, including sleep in between those repetitions over time. So if you're going to do 10 hours every single day for 8 hours, you're probably going to do worse than if you do 2 hours religiously every single day for 20 days or 30 days, because you're giving your brain more opportunities to encounter the pattern, absorb it all, do the work, and then sleep on it, and then have that opportunity to consolidate it and have it go deeper in your memory. So the key, of course, if you go this route, is that, let's say the 2 or 3 hours you do budget, they have to be real. Like I would say one thing that I did in a more extreme way than some of my peers early on was taking the idea of like context switching and attention seriously. My phone has been on do not disturb for like 5 years now. And because I don't want to be bothered. I want to encounter disruptions on my own terms. And it turns out that actually you can get away with that a lot, as long as like friends and family and loved ones are cool with that, right? Like that's the main thing you have to deal with if you're going that route. But what I'm saying is that in the 2 to 3 hours that you're budgeting for focus, like block everything. Like block, you cannot go and check Facebook, you cannot go on Twitter, you cannot like be kind of sort of being in Messenger and kind of sort of programming. And it's really hard to do that because everything around us has conspired to just like distract you as much as possible and get your eyes and attention over there. So things that feel extreme, like putting your phone on do not disturb for years on end, and this, I don't view them as actually extreme practices. I view them as actually we're in an arms race with with the reality of modern technology. And so the practices you have to adopt may seem extreme, but they're not extreme in the context of the arms race that we're in, right, for our attention. And then the last part I would say on this is essentially the social dimension of motivation and learning. I am a big believer in essentially accountability through feeling embarrassed when you meet with someone and you've made no progress, right? So you have so many colleagues, I'm sure, you've met some wonderful people in your time in the program, and maintaining some of those relationships and having a weekly call where you recap what you've done in the last week can be really valuable, because no one wants to be the person that shows up and says, I've done nothing for the last week, even though, sometimes it happens. It helps, it's essentially the fear of shame can offset the effect of procrastination that we all feel and the problems of motivation, right? So to kind of summarize here, I would say one is true deep work, but at in a time amount that is reasonable, not burning yourself out, and treating it as a marathon rather than some kind of like manic sprint that you're going to take care of in a week or two or something. And the other is true focus, and the other is social. I would say the one kind of eccentric thing that I did do on my road was I hired a programmer to actually go and sit with me, to pair program with me. And that was also an accountability thing for me, where he was unemployed at the time. So it was like a good deal. It was cheap, but it was like, I didn't want to look bad and like I had not done any work between the times that he and I sat together. So that was another way of driving that accountability and motivation.
Some amazing points. I really enjoy you shared them, and actually we do have pair programming opportunities for our students in during different times in during their time with practicum. So I hope after hearing this from you, the value of pair programming, they will also be more eager to try it if they haven't done so yet. So let's move to some career and job search related questions. First of all, I wanted to ask you, when you were starting in tech, now that you've already been in tech for a while, try to remember the time when you were just starting, and please share with us, how did you approach the job search, and how did you approach finding opportunities for real life experience?
I would say that the first thing for me was like figuring out what I want, which of course is often easier said than done. I had kind of honed down on the idea that I wanted to work at an early stage startup because I wanted to have the experience of going from 0 to 1 with a solution. And at least and not everyone likes that. And I'm not knocking, like, say, going to work for a big company or whatever. It's just like different people and different personalities and things like different kinds of things. And so for me personally, that narrowed down a lot of the sort of prospective companies, and also my strategy. Because for instance, early stage startups are, in my experience, they select a little bit harder on soft skills stuff and like work ethic and familiarity with their tech stack. Whereas larger companies are maybe, they're going to maybe select a little bit harder on, can you pass these like algorithm tests and stuff like that, depending on the company, right? So given that was the case, I said, okay, what I need to do, given that this is the outcome I want, is I just need to optimize like my communication and my portfolio and my behaviors around reaching these early stage companies. So I did a couple things to that end. The one was putting together a portfolio site, and where the portfolio site didn't just put up like a couple of the projects that I went on. I went to great length to like just talk about like life and what I'm interested in, and like I did this thing one time, and this kind of stuff, because that can help communicate the kind of person that you are. And especially an earlier stage company, right? They want to know, am I bringing someone on the team that I'm going to like, and that like they're nice or they're interesting and like they're going to work hard, and they're going to be fun to collaborate with, and that doesn't come across necessarily that easily if I just have like a couple of GitHub repos and like my name on my portfolio. So that was like a concrete thing in my portfolio that I did to optimize for that search. The other thing that I did was I essentially told everyone I know that I was looking for a programming job, where anyone that would ask, like friends, family, relatives, acquaintances, anyone, because you're oftentimes like, you may not know someone that is, say, like runs a startup or like works in tech or whatever, but I was consistently amazed at how many people are just 2 degrees away from you. Your cousin knows the founder of whatever, your former roommate now works as like the marketing person for Google Ads or whatever. And it's like, there are a lot of these connections where there's even actually a technical term, if anyone is interested, called weak ties. And there's someone named Mark Granovetter who's done this whole study around weak ties, meaning people that you are not immediately friends with, but it's like friends of friends or friends of relatives, and how determining this can be in career success. So essentially, take advantage of your weak ties. Just tell everyone. Like, I feel like sometimes many early stage developers feel embarrassed that they're in a job search, especially if, like me, like you had a career already. It wasn't like you're fresh out of university necessarily. It feels weird to be like going around and telling everyone I'm trying to find this job now, but like you're just sabotaging yourself. So for me, it's like shameless. I just like shamelessly told everyone. And actually, I'll show you how shameless I am. I actually printed stickers. I designed and printed these stickers that put on my laptop that say, ask me about web development, so that when I was in a cafe or anywhere, I would open the door to a potential conversation with someone. And I still leave these on now, even now, because it's like people will come over and maybe I can get a consulting gig or something out of it. So leaving that door open permanently, as far as I'm concerned, is like worth it. And especially at the beginning, because random strangers are like, companies are so desperate for engineers that random strangers will approach you if they know that you have technical skills. So like, this really happens, and it happens a lot, but you have to actually tell people that you have the skills. If you don't tell anyone, it's never going to work. So just tell people. And then I guess, oh yeah, and then the last thing I would say is like the send 50,000 resumes approach is like probably not a great way to go. I think it both because it seems to hurt people's motivation, because they're like, I've sent 1,000 resumes and like no one has responded, and what's going on or whatever. Being a bit more intentional about wanting to work somewhere, and like kind of customizing the approach a little bit more, and speaking in, you know, their language, and maybe writing directly to them, to someone in the company, you're much more likely to get at least a response, right? And the bigger companies that have these bigger like automated things, it can be hard to break in there if all you're doing, if you're just another resume on the pile, essentially. And I think sadly, it's like, in particular, if you don't have a traditional tech background, you can be selected against a little bit by their automated systems. And there's more openness now. Like, I think this is changing, but like the more personal approach works, especially if you're coming from a non like CS background. So yeah, there you go.
Thank you very much, Zach. And for those who haven't had a chance to see Zach's website, I definitely recommend looking at it. I spent quite a long time there. I don't want to admit how long exploring it and listening to music. It's really a cool place to get inspired, I think, for building your personal landing page. And I see there are a couple of questions that I want to jump to in the chat before we continue. So one question is from Emmanuel, asking, if you are asked at the interview, what skills do you think you have to improve on as a junior developer about to enter an industry? Could you please give some tips to answering questions like this?
So I would say the strategic answer there is to focus on things that there's no reasonable expectation that you should know. So for example, as a junior developer, companies don't expect you to be architecting solutions end to end at, you know, a really high level of sophistication. They don't expect you to know, you know, to be considering issues of, say, like scalability or redundancy, or, you know, like these kinds of things, because it's just simply, it's earlier in your career, and you're going to be encountering those things as you build solutions, right? As the junior developer, the expectation is that you have the procedural fluency in the language and tools necessary to be a contributing member of the team. So it's like, they don't want you to join the team and then find out, oh, you're a JavaScript developer, but it turns out you can't write JavaScript or something like that. And like, now we have to wait for you for 6 months to like learn how to write JavaScript just to be able to do the job. That's what they're afraid of, right? They don't want you to just like take forever to become productive. So what I would focus the answer on is, look, I want to skill up on a more systems level understanding of technology. I have not worked on systems that are at a big scale, or that, you know, deal with a lot of traffic. You know, I have not had to maybe architect features from end to end that touch all parts of the stack yet. But what I can tell you is that, like, I know React really well. I know how to interact with a NoSQL database really well. I know how to build an API endpoint in Express or Flask or whatever it is, whatever, you know, framework you're doing. And like the tool, I am bringing competency in those tools where I know with guidance on the team on these more architectural things, like I'm going to be able to contribute to the bottom line of this. So yeah, that's what I would say.
Thank you very much, Zach. And there's another question, and they're kind of connected. Tell us about your feeling after unsuccessful interviews, if you had any. And also there is a question about imposter syndrome. How do you deal with imposter syndrome? And I think they can happen together, especially after an unsuccessful interview. So if you could maybe elaborate on that.
I mean, the imposter syndrome stuff, I feel like it's just kind of, it's eternal, sadly. Like even in, you know, the company that I work with now, when I joined the company, they were using a framework that I wasn't familiar with. So there are aspects of that framework that I don't know. And sometimes I'm in conversations and I'm just like, you get that wave of like, oh my God, everyone's going to realize that I'm secretly incompetent and know nothing, like this kind of, it's like totally unproductive way of thinking about yourself and your expertise that just comes from encountering something that you don't know in the moment. But so it kind of doesn't go away. So at least for me, I view it as like, what's the management strategy, right? As opposed to this will definitely go away, someday. The management strategy, from my perspective, is that I see when you have an unsuccessful interview, and then you feel like an imposter, you feel like a fraud, or you feel like I'm not good enough for this, I'm not smart enough for this. Like, who was I kidding when I studied economics in college, and now I think I can be a developer or whatever. It's like that. Once that kicks off, especially after an unsuccessful interview, I think it can very easily become essentially a feedback loop where your confidence is bruised, and then you have another interview, and people can smell, sadly, like that self-doubt in a person, and it's not a good look. And so it can even hurt your ability to do subsequent interviews because your self-doubt is hurting, and then bad things are happening, and it's hurting your self-doubt, and it could be a very like kind of tragic downward spiral for your own psychology and your own job search. So from my perspective, it's basically like trying to shock the system out of this loop. And essentially, when I had unsuccessful interviews, and I did have unsuccessful interviews, and I would guarantee you, even if I just like took on a job search now, I would still, possibly have unsuccessful interviews depending on what it was for. It's just like a fact of life, right? And I just immediately would tell myself after the unsuccessful interview, you know what? It's like their loss, because I'm going to be a great developer when someone finally decides to take a chance on me. And like, I'm just going to essentially forget about the interview. And I realize that probably sounds like a sort of avoidant pattern or something like this, but I really think it's just like, you can't mull it, you can't focus on it. You just have to go on to the next opportunity. If you did something that you're conscious of, that you can say learn from, obviously you don't want to forget that. Like, I said some stupid thing during some interview or whatever, you want to remember that. But if you get fixated on the failure, it's just terrible. So like, have another interview scheduled so that instead your stress moves to, I need to do this other interview. Have your accountability group going where you're expected to, show up and do this stuff. And really just, it's almost like a process of self-brainwashing, which sounds so ridiculous when you say it, but I truly believe it is this self-fulfilling prophecy of telling yourself over and over again, like, no, actually, I can do this. Like, I made it through the boot camp. I passed the test. Like, I can actually do this. And eventually someone is going to recognize my capabilities. And I don't know any other like shortcut other than just refocusing your mind towards the future than what has passed, sadly.
Before we move to the questions from our students, I know that they have more. I wanted to ask one more thing. So some of our students are concerned that the tech market is getting oversaturated with bootcamp graduates and people who learn coding themselves. So from your perspective as a senior software engineer and software consultant, what do you think about it? Is it true or is it not true? And what are the niches or maybe opportunities that you think are often overlooked by new software developers, data analysts, or those who want to enter a tech world?
Sure. So I totally understand this perception. And even like, some years ago in like, I don't know, 2016 or something, like I felt that same perception too. But I think the numbers don't tell that story. So my understanding, I'm going to forget the exact values here of these numbers, but my understanding is that software, like essentially like postings for software engineers grew by like 22% last year. And I think the average is like 4% for like professions overall. In the US, I may be off a bit here, but I think there is something like 1 million unfilled IT oriented positions, like engineering positions in this. So I think it's like the idea that there's like not enough jobs out there for people that are getting into tech. I just don't think the numbers bear that out. And I think the trend is only in the direction that is in our favor as developers, which is more and more and more demand. And the supply just can't, I think will always have some amount of bottleneck, because even with a great program like a practicum or something like that, that creates this on-ramp, there will always be only a subset of people who are willing to take on the risk and investment and time and effort to make that switch. So if you think of it that way, I think everyone in this call that is like serious about it, your career prospects are great, because the supply is constrained and demand is growing, which means that those are all positive trends for our own, our own careers in the future. Now, what most people say when I say this is, yeah, that's fine. But what I'm talking about is like new people in the industry, that there's a lot of like junior developers out now, and like that's a different game than when you're already in the industry. I agree that getting your first developer job is harder, and it's the hardest like job to get. In fact, I can tell you, it's like, I'm not exaggerating when I tell you that the day that on LinkedIn I changed, like I added that I was employed at a company, like as a developer, I suddenly received like huge amounts of recruiter spam, when like just that day before I was having a hard time getting interviews because I was an untested, unknown developer. So really just getting over that initial hill does open up a huge amount of opportunity. So let's talk about the junior developer glut, if there is one. Companies will hire you if you are good. It really is that simple. It really, truly is. And I can tell you that like at any skill level, if you distinguish yourself in the interview as someone who is good, you will get hired, because companies are so desperate. And even people who have been in the industry for a while, they often still, like, they will fail interviews and stuff like this. Like in the last year, I've probably done maybe 40 interviews. And I can tell you that like there's a handful, less than 10 of those people have been hired, simply because they don't distinguish themselves in the interviews as they're actually good at the craft. So in my opinion, like if you are just getting started, the number one thing to focus yourself on is just becoming good and communicating to people that you are good at it. And there are all these like, tricks and other kinds of things that people are going to tell you about, but substance wins the day, because you show up in the interview and you're calm and you're collected and you ship the code or you know the answer, and that's what people want to see. So I understand that it probably feels like a cop-out answer to say, oh, well, there are all these people, and like, is that, does that hurt my career prospects? And I would say, no, it doesn't hurt your career prospects if you just focus on doing the practice necessary to become good. And I can tell you in my bootcamp experience that the people who really were serious about doing the work necessary to become good, they were hired within a couple months. And people who just sat at home and they sort of like passively sent resumes out, to like random companies without any kind of thought to it, they were the ones that were frustrated. So just like taking that proactive approach and you'll get it. Another thing I would say here is that anything in your background that differentiates you, capitalize on it. Let's say you're a musician or something like that, and there's a startup that you're interested in that's in the music space. Communicate yourself in a way that shows that you have domain understanding of, say, those problems or something. So it's just don't be another resume on the automated pile. And it's totally possible for everyone in this call to do that, because there is there's an infinite degree to which people can differentiate themselves in the industry. So it's just finding the thing that is like you and uniquely you, and kind of like pulling that out and being thoughtful about how you communicate it, being good at your craft.
Connecting one of the questions that we have from our students, how do you differentiate yourself or approach this process when you do not have an advanced degree in statistics, math, computer science? Any thoughts on that?
I do think that is probably a greater concern in the more, say, data-oriented tracks, right? Like becoming a data scientist or something like that, than it is in, say, a traditional software engineering track. I have friends who work, as data scientists in this, and like there does seem to be a bit stronger pressure for that kind of advanced degree stuff. But I would say that, again, at this point in your career, the goal is to get in the door. It's not necessarily like to be hired as a super advanced, data scientist right away, because once you're in the door, you have the chance to distinguish yourself. And once you and to grow, and then once you have that growth, it's much easier to transfer to the kind of title or level of seniority that you're desiring. But it's like maybe aiming to be, principal data scientist for some startup fresh out of boot camp is probably not a realistic goal, right? Being a data engineer, a data analyst, sort of like a assistant to a data scientist is probably realistic. And then when you prove yourself that you're actually good, then that path opens to you, right? So it's like the advanced degree thing, it matters. But again, if you can get in the door, and I do think you can get in the door without an advanced degree, it matters less. And I would also just follow that up by saying that building something cool, right, during your job, your job search process really goes a long way. And I would say the like many crappy little things version of like data science that I've seen that works well is, for instance, building a couple different deep learning architectures from scratch, for example. They don't have to be like major, huge models, but for example, can you build a recurrent neural network? Can you build a, image classifier, this kind of thing, using the underlying technologies rather than just consuming an external library? And that's an example where it's not only like sort of practical and like a real thing, but it shows that you don't just know how to use like a library like Pandas or one of these libraries, but you are actually like interested in the fundamental kinds of things that come up later in the career where you become the architect of the model or something like that. I've also seen people do really cool analyses of some niche associated with a company that they're interested in. Like someone that I know, she did this analysis of how does Spotify recommend you music? And she talked about their machine learning architecture. And she received a job offer from Spotify based on that blog post, because it showed, and she's not, has no math degree or anything like that. It was irrelevant, right? Because she showed that she was competent, right? Through what she wrote there.
So we're getting many questions, and I apologize to our audience that we won't be able to answer all of them because we of course have limited time, but I want to pick a few questions that we already have. Which do you think is better for getting the first job, since we are talking about jobs? Broad knowledge, when you can fill many roles, or specialization, mastery in one niche?
I think it depends on how you define how specialized you mean. So for example, you could say like web development is a specialization where, for example, you learn a JavaScript oriented stack, right? And in a sense, that is a specialization. But you could also argue that that's pretty broad, because you're not like an expert in, say, I don't know, real-time audio processing inside the browser or something like that, which would be some like super specific niche, right? So if we're talking about specialization at the level of, say, a tech stack, I do think that's important, basically for and I should say it's important and effective for your job search, because again, companies, many companies, they don't want to wait 6 months for you to like learn a totally unrelated stack. They're interested in, say, like, how can you get up to speed quickly? I think this is one area where data has a big advantage, because the data stack has consolidated so much around a certain set of libraries, and also basically like Python as the lingua franca. Whereas web development, it's a little bit like there's a lot of JavaScript, but then there's also PHP, there's Python oriented development, there's like banks that use C#, stuff like this. So pick a stack, get really good at the stack, build stuff with the stack, try to find companies that use that stack or use a stack that is at least somewhat familiar. Like, think of the Venn diagram as like one or two things maybe that overlap with your stack. That's good enough for most companies. You don't have to limit yourself that way, but like if it were me, I would pick those companies with a Venn diagram overlap as the first companies I contacted, and then ones that use a totally unrelated stack a bit further down the list, because I'm not going to be able to make as convincing of a case about my skills to them.
Thank you. And actually, it answers one of the questions about the how to approach the job search and interviewing process. So I'm not going to get there because I think you gave a great tip here. Let's talk very quickly about age. How do you think age plays out on interviews, and can being older or younger affect your chances to be accepted? And if so, what can be done to negate?
I do think it is a sad fact of tech that, you know, ageism is a real thing, but I do think it is kind of less of a thing than maybe a lot of people would think. Like, I think essentially the like Mark Zuckerberg stereotype is out there in the world, where it's like, what, you're 22 and you're not a billionaire yet? Like, what's wrong with you, right? It's, you know, there is like that narrative out there, but the overwhelming majority of tech companies don't really think that way. And especially if you get out of like VC-backed startups in particular, you often have people who are older. And I don't mean like, you know, with the view that they're old or something, but they're not fresh out of college. You know, they're more seasoned professionals. The other reality is that I think the ageism often gets encountered more when there isn't a clear growth trajectory. Like the red flag I've seen people, in my opinion, kind of unfairly use, but that I think is like, it is a thing that does happen, sadly, is like you see someone that maybe there wasn't maybe a lot of career growth previously, they moved into tech, and if there isn't a strong signal that they're really like gung-ho about like pushing hard once they're in technology, there can be a little bit of a negative, you know, a negative perception there. Which again is like probably not fair, but I do think it probably exists. There is a kind of other dimension here though, which is I don't think it's the case that younger is always better. And I would say the overwhelming majority of engineers that have been in the industry for a while do not have the perception that, yes, we should just hire like the youngest person that we interview or something like that. I don't really think that's the thought at all. In fact, I would say there's even maybe a little bit of a bias in the other direction, which is like, we want like the cranky 39-year-old who's been around the block, you know, something like that, as opposed to, you know, the idea of, oh, I want the like optimistic, like idealistic, you know, 21-year-old or something like that. Again, these are obviously sort of cliches or like archetypes that people use to describe the age distribution in technology. And I don't think there is a consistent pattern of like, definitely you should feel super discriminated against based on your age. And it's also not always the case that older is worse and younger is better. It just, I think, comes to owning where you are in your career. Because for instance, I've seen some older developers that start in the company and pretty quickly they're trusted with more responsibility, or even maybe with a team, you know, because in part they demonstrate a certain maturity that comes with being further along in your career, or even just with age, right? So yeah, don't get hung up on it. It is a real thing, but like a kind of company that you want to work for isn't going to hold it against you. You know, you don't want to work for people that are that decide they're not going to hire you just because they, you know, it probably means the company is full of like garbage interpersonal dynamics anyway.
We're getting close to the end, and I want to get back to a question about that is connected to learning, to studying. Can you talk a little bit about the pressure of deadlines? Because I think deadlines come up for our students as they go through the program, but deadlines is obviously something that you face at work. Any strategies here that you can share?
One thing that I've definitely learned is that the engineer, you have to be very active as an engineer in your interface with the rest of the business. If you just let other people define your tasks and stuff for you, basically they'll overwhelm you with like random feature ideas, and like someone, you know, two product managers got drunk on Friday and decided that this would be a great idea, and then on Monday it's like a whole bunch of tickets that they're giving you. And you know, it sounds like a joke, but like that kind of stuff does actually happen, where it's not really clear why something was decided to be shipped and it was like kind of given to you. As you get more confident in your role, you become more confident pushing back a bit. And I don't mean, you know, being mean or fighting with your colleagues or anything, but pushing back a little bit, like, is this really the most important use of our time and our resources right now? Or is this something that we should wait on? The reason I'm talking about this is that deadlines are a constant reality. There's no escaping deadlines. And the only thing that saves developers from the kind of, let's say the tragedy of the missed deadline is to find smart ways to cut scope. So instead of doing the 100% version of a feature, you're not going to be able to do that, or you're coming up on the deadline, you have to be able to tell your stakeholders in the company, listen, we can get to like the 80% version, and this is why this last 20% is like not that important for this version, and we can carry it on into the next sprint or something like that. But the onus is often on you, because other people in the company and even developers themselves are not great at estimating how long it takes to build something. It's really hard to estimate like deadlines in a reliable way. So you have to be proactive enough to have that negotiation about scope so that you don't just get drowned by deadlines all the time. The other thing is, I would say, if your company offers you, say, like unlimited time off for like these kinds of policies, for me, I take time off after sprints because it gives time for like your brain to recover after the intensity of a sprint. And that really helps with the feeling of like being overwhelmed by the constant deadlines that are the reality in technology, in engineering.
We're coming to the hour, so I really want for us to finish on time and respect your time, Zach. So I want to stop here and thank you for joining us today. It was very inspiring for me, and I very much hope that it was inspiring for our students. I am going to send a link right now in the chat for everyone to Zach's website. If you haven't seen it yet, go there and enjoy it. And once again, thanks for everyone for joining us. It was exciting to have a group from all over the world. I think I even saw Argentina somewhere when we were starting. And again, thank you, Zach, very much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you all. Thank you all very much. It's great to be here with you. And please don't hesitate to email me if you'd like to follow up about something in this talk. My email is it's hello@zach.dev, the domain that was just posted there, but I'll put it in the chat. And I'm always happy to hear from people. And if any of you are ever in Denver, let me know, and we'll do some pair programming or something.
Wonderful. That's a great idea. All right, so we'll be finishing here. Have a wonderful rest of your day, whether it's morning, afternoon, or evening, and see you all at our future events. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.